When you place lab-grown meat and lab-made milk side by side, it becomes immediately clear that halacha does not approach them as two variations of the same technological innovation. Instead, they occupy fundamentally different conceptual categories. And understanding why is essential, because the contrast not only helps clarify halakhic boundaries, it also shows how deeply the tradition can adapt while preserving its core logic. Lab-grown meat, or cultivated meat, begins with actual animal cells. These cells are taken from a living creature, often a small biopsy from a cow, chicken, or fish, and then placed in a nutrient-rich medium where they multiply and form tissues that resemble conventional meat. Even though the process eventually takes place outside the animal, halacha tracks the origin of the substance. Meat is meat because it comes from an animal's flesh. A cultured chicken cutlet still traces its identity back to the initial animal cells, and that origin anchors its status in Jewish law. If the original biopsy came from a non-kosher animal or from a kosher animal not slaughtered through shechita, classical sources indicate that the halakhic identity would remain as non-kosher. The substance's starting point does not dissolve simply because it continues growing in a controlled environment. This is why cultivated meat triggers a series of thorny questions. Was the animal alive when the cells were taken? Does harvesting cells resemble taking a piece of non-slaughtered flesh, which is forbidden? Does the growth medium resemble blood or other animal derivatives that carry their own restrictions? Even in more lenient frameworks, cultivated meat inevitably interacts with existing laws governing how animals must be treated, how meat must be obtained, and how its status is determined. Halacha sees continuity between the living animal and the eventual cultured product, because the cells themselves are a direct extension of that original creature. Lab-made milk, specifically precision-fermented dairy proteins, is entirely different. Instead of starting with an animal, producers start with microbes. Yeast or fungi are programmed with a strand of information copied from a cow, the genetic instruction for making casein or whey, the core proteins that give milk its structure. But that copied sequence is not an animal cell. It is simply a digital blueprint, the way a recipe describes a challah without being made of dough. The microbes themselves remain the ones doing the work, and they are not halakhically animals. They produce dairy-identical proteins in fermentation tanks, and the final product contains no cells, tissue, or biological components originating from a cow. This distinction, cells versus code, flesh versus fermentation, maps cleanly onto halakhic categories. Halacha generally treats microbial fermentation as the creation of a new substance. It does not place microorganisms in the same category as animals, and it has never assigned them the halakhic weight of biological origin that applies to meat. So, precision-fermented milk proteins do not inherit the halakhic identity of cow milk simply because the recipe came from a cow genome. There is no milking, no animal-based substance, and no transfer of living tissue. The product may look, behave, and taste like dairy, but it lacks the underlying halakhic trigger that defines dairy as dairy. This is why the halakhic conversation surrounding lab-made milk feels smooth, even optimistic. While cultivated meat invites debates about kashrut, slaughter, and cellular continuity, precision-fermented dairy invites discussions about labeling, pareve status, and how modern food technologies can expand kosher options. Many authorities view lab-made milk as a potential pareve breakthrough, a way to enjoy dairy-like foods without any of the halakhic entanglements that historically accompanied them. It is not simply that the technology avoids problems, it actively resolves them. Consider, for example, the laws of Beisar Bishalav, the prohibition on mixing meat and milk. Cultivated meat is still meat, so its pairing restrictions remain in full force. But precision-fermented dairy proteins arguably never become halakhically dairy at all. This opens a creative space where fleishig restaurants could potentially serve real-tasting cheeseburgers without violating any biblical or rabbinic laws. Far from straining halakhic categories, this technology fits comfortably within them, expanding what is possible for observant consumers while maintaining fidelity to the letter and spirit of Jewish dietary law. The contrast grows even sharper when considering Shalav Yisrael requirements. Cultivated meat does not help solve the traditional issues surrounding non-kosher slaughter or supervision. It replays them in a different environment. But precision-fermented milk avoids them entirely. Since no animal is milked, there is nothing to supervise in the classical sense. The halakhic mechanics simply do not apply. What emerges instead is a cleaner, more controllable, and sometimes more kosher-friendly food landscape. Even the broader ethical context favors precision-fermented dairy. Cultivated meat aims to replace or reduce slaughter, but it still requires interaction with animals and often leverages growth media that require refinement to meet kosher standards. Precision-fermented dairy, by contrast, can be wholly decoupled from animal welfare debates altogether. And halacha tends to view technological shifts that reduce harm, especially unnecessary harm, as religiously meaningful, even if not strictly required. So the differences matter. They reveal how halacha assigns identity based not on outward resemblance, but on substance and source. Meat grown from animal cells retains its bond to the parent organism. Milk proteins grown from microbes do not inherit the status of the animal from which their genetic code was originally copied. And this divergence helps highlight halacha's inner consistency. It is not technology that drives the distinction, but the deeper logic of how Torah law defines the origins of food. Perhaps the most encouraging takeaway is what these cases collectively demonstrate about halacha's relationship to modern science. Halacha is not hostile to innovation. It simply places each new material within the correct conceptual box. When a technology respects those categories, it can expand the kosher world in powerful and uplifting ways. Precision-fermented dairy may prove to be one of the most helpful food developments in recent memory, not because it skirts tradition, but because it aligns with it. And even cultivated meat, despite its complexities, invites new thinking and the potential for future solutions. In the end, the contrast between lab-grown meat and lab-made milk is not a story of difficulty versus ease, but one of two very different biological processes entering the halakhic system on their own terms. One starts with living flesh and therefore carries the weight of centuries of laws about animals, slaughter, and meat consumption. The other begins with microorganisms and produces something that looks like dairy, but may not be dairy at all. And seeing this contrast so clearly is what allows halacha to respond confidently, thoughtfully, and most strikingly, with the kind of optimism that reminds us how tradition can grow right alongside the technologies shaping our world.